Imagine standing in a ditch, no wider than your outstretched arms, the walls packed with cold, waterlogged clay that never truly dries. The sky above is a narrow grey strip, periodically illuminated by distant artillery fire. The ground beneath your boots is not quite solid. It shifts and sinks, and you have learned not to think too hard about why. The Western Front was not simply a battlefield. It was a sensory assault that broke men not only through violence, but through the relentless, grinding weight of what they had to endure between the fighting. It is in that space, between the shells, where the real story of World War I Fieldcraft lives. Veterans who survived the trenches spoke repeatedly about one thing above all others: the smell, decay, standing water, unwashed bodies, cordite, and the sweet, sickly odour that experienced soldiers recognized without needing to be told what it was. Death in its most unfiltered form. This olfactory landscape was not a backdrop to the war. For many men, it became the war itself, a constant psychological presence that eroded morale and mental stability as surely as any bombardment. It is within this context that the personal handkerchief takes on an almost sacred significance. Soldiers frequently kept small cloths, often sent from home, sometimes carrying traces of lavender water, violet perfume, or simply the scent of a familiar drawer or a mother's wardrobe pressed to their faces during the worst moments. This was not vanity. It was a deliberate, instinctive act of psychological survival. The human brain processes scent through the limbic system, the same region governing emotion and memory, which means a single breath of something familiar could, for just a moment, replace the trench with a kitchen, a garden, a life worth fighting to return to. These small cloths were portable anchors to sanity, and soldiers understood their value even without the language of modern psychology. Beyond the psychological, survival in the trenches demanded extraordinary practical ingenuity. The trenches themselves were not simply dug. They were engineered by the men who lived in them, constantly reinforced with timber, sandbags, and salvaged materials. The fire step, the duckboard, the dugout carved into the trench wall. These were not issued by command. They were solutions born from desperation and hard-won fieldcraft knowledge, passed between soldiers like currency. Dugouts were the closest thing to shelter most men knew for months at a stretch. Carved several feet into the earth, they offered marginal protection from shrapnel and the elements, though they flooded regularly and harbored rats in numbers that honestly defied belief. Soldiers learned to waterproof their sleeping areas using oilskin ground sheets and packed straw when it could be found, a technique not far removed from what any experienced bushcrafter would recognize as debris insulation. Warmth was everything in the winter months, and men became expert at generating it from almost nothing, huddling together, layering clothing, and using body heat with a calculation born of necessity rather than comfort. Food and water in the trenches were never guaranteed, and what arrived was rarely appetizing. Rations came forward after dark, carried by working parties through communication trenches under the constant threat of shell fire. Soldiers learned to heat food using small, improvised stoves, often nothing more than a biscuit tin, with holes punched into the sides, burning whatever fuel could be found. This is, in essence, the same hobo stove principle that bushcraft instructors teach today, and it worked then for exactly the same reasons it works now. Controlled airflow, minimal fuel, maximum efficiency. Water was collected from shell craters, and rain catchment systems improvised from ground sheets and mess tins, then treated with iodine tablets when available. Men developed an acute awareness of contamination risk in a way that most modern people never need to, recognizing the difference between standing water that had been filtered through earth and surface water that carried the runoff of a battlefield. These were survival skills sharpened by fatal consequence. The trenches produced some of the most sophisticated fieldcraft in military history, particularly around concealment and movement. Snipers on both sides elevated camouflage to a lethal art form, constructing elaborate hides from Hessian, paint, and natural materials, sometimes spending entire days motionless in no man's land, inside sculpted dummy figures or carefully constructed scrapes. The patience and environmental awareness required mirrored exactly what hunters and stalkers have practiced for centuries. Noise discipline was equally critical. Soldiers learned to move through their own trench systems in near silence, communicating through hand signals and learned habit, aware that sound carried differently at night and that a carelessly struck match could draw a sniper's attention from hundreds of meters away. This instinctive environmental awareness, reading wind, light, sound, and terrain as an integrated system, is the foundation of all serious fieldcraft, and World War I soldiers practiced it under conditions where the margin for error was absolute. What the soldiers of the Western Front teach us across more than a century of distance is that human adaptability is more powerful than almost any external circumstance. They built community in holes in the ground. They found humor, tenderness, and meaning in the worst conditions imaginable. And they carried small pieces of home, a scented cloth, a photograph, a folded letter, because they understood intuitively that the mind must be sustained alongside the body if either is to survive. For those of us drawn to bushcraft, preparedness, and the study of resilience, this is not just history. It is a masterclass. The tools change, the terrain shifts, but the principles, resourcefulness, adaptability, psychological grounding, and the wisdom to find beauty even in brutal places remain exactly the same. If this episode gave you something to think about, subscribe to Fieldcraft Chronicles and share it with someone who values history, self-reliance, and the enduring art of survival. Every share keeps this kind of storytelling alive, and that matters.